Hi, I'm Peter Reynolds, and welcome to Mother Nature Doesn't Give a Crap with Geoff Sheffrin. We are all going to die. Maybe not today, but soon, geologically speaking. And what about humanity? Will we survive into the next millennium? Or will we go out dinosaur style with a giant asteroid? Or have AI take over the planet? Or maybe just good old-fashioned nuclear annihilation? Or does Mother Nature finally get fed up with us and give the big middle finger in terms of catastrophic floods, droughts, and superstorms? On today's episode, we're going to be looking at the worst-case scenarios for humanity and what can be done to help turn the tide before it's too late. And joining me as always is professional engineer, environmental activist, and self-proclaimed fifth horseman of the apocalypse, Geoff Sheffrin. Geoff, welcome back to the podcast.
Peter, thank you. As always, your creative introductions just set the tone. I love it. So we're up for our doom and gloom meeting today.
Absolutely, Geoff. And I guess that's really the first question is, why did you feel we needed to have a doom and gloom episode?
Well, the issue is that we've been talking for the last 6 episodes about the climate crisis, and we've gone through a shopping list of things that we need to do. And I think that is pretty self-evident, and in the next episode, we're going to be covering more of these things, but I thought it was time to reflect on where are we as a species in the context of the climate crisis. So I'm referring to this as my doom and gloom episode because I feel this is very much where we are, and I don't think we really appreciate the problems that we're in.
So maybe we can then talk about that, the two primary causes that can lead to our extinction.
Okay, let me put my thoughts into perspective. People by now, particularly those that have seen all the podcasts, they'll know that I'm an engineer, I'm a rational thinker. I look at my facts and figures about the climate crisis in detail to make sure that I've got them from reliable sources. And even reliable sources have a bit of variability, but that's what I'm doing. So on the basis of that, this is an episode where I've dug into a much bigger, broader picture, which I have not researched, but I've done enough research on it to be able to talk about it. Now, I'm not a clairvoyant. I'm not a futurist, right? No, let me correct that. I'm not a fortune teller, but I think I'm something of a futurist by virtue of my background and my training and how I look at things in the world. After all, one of my businesses, I do strategic work for clients. So, am I a futurist? Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't matter. The point is we are dealing with a doom and gloom thing. So, I really wanted to start off with the very big picture of where we are, in my opinion.
So, where are we then, Geoff?
Well, let's put this planet, our planet Earth, into perspective. The universe was created 13.7, 13.8 billion years ago. A little before yours and my time. The sun, our sun in our solar system, is about 4.6 billion years old. Our Earth, our little planet, is about 4.5 billion years old. So this chunk of space debris that we reside on is 4.5 billion years old and has been forming itself and continues to form itself. It hasn't finished. It'll finish forming itself when it disintegrates as a planet. So what am I looking at? I'm looking at our planet, which in the context of the universe might be about the size of a grain of sand on a large beach. There are billions of grains of sand, and ours is about as irrelevant as the rest of them. Yet this is our home. We're the species that have developed here. But our development here is, we didn't create it, it's fortuitous, it just happened. Should I dig into that a little more?
Well, when you said you were going to put it in context, I didn't realize the context of the known universe, Geoff. So I'm very happy to have you go on.
All right. In that case, let me go on with the next piece. When you go through the 4.5 billion years, let me go back to the last 800,000 years. 800,000 years. I've been reading some research from something called the Greenland Ice Project. It's one of about 6 projects which over the last 40 or 50 years have been tackled on Greenland. And these projects have gone down 2 kilometers and pulled up the ice core crust from 2 kilometers deep. And the neat thing about the ice core crust is at every layer, every centimeter on the way down, it locks in what was going on the planet at that time. So a 2-kilometer core down, which is what they've done, gets me to 800,000 years of history. When you look at the history, and I now get back to the ice ages, the planet has evolved through volcanoes and ice age, and you mentioned at the outset, the dinosaur annihilation from an asteroid, etc. But why have human beings, if we've been around 4.6 billion years, why haven't human beings evolved the way we are today much earlier? Well, when you look at the ice ages, the last serious ice age we had was it stopped about 130,000 years ago, right? Then we were into the next ice age, and a few tens of thousands of years ago, we climbed out of that ice age, and we got to where we are today in terms of temperature profiles. What's interesting about ice age temperature profiles, in the depth of an ice age, the average planet temperature is about -8 degrees Celsius. Versus right now, the average planet temperature is about 0 degrees Celsius. And people will look at that and say, 8 degrees Celsius? When it's -20 in Toronto, I put a parka on and we go out. That's not the point. The point is that when you have a -8 degrees Celsius around the whole planet, the Arctic ice cap goes all the way down to France and Spain, covers Canada, goes into the northern US, covers China, down into parts of India. The polar ice cap isn't just a bit that we know now, it's down past the Tropic of Capricorn. From the south end, it covers Australia, etc., goes up to the Tropic of Cancer. So you have this thin band around the equator, which at -8 gave sustainability, because the question would be, if Neanderthal man was around 1 million years ago, how come he didn't extinct himself in the Ice Age? Well, he didn't expand because he didn't have the resources, because the world was very limited in what it could give him. He was from Asia out to probably the west side of France, Europe, effectively. That was his span. Lots of little colonies, but it never gelled as a species. And for whatever reason, it became extinct. I haven't studied that. That's not my purpose. What is special about today, where we are, is that in the last 6, 7, or 8,000 years, if you look at these ice borings, these drillings from the Denmark Greenland project, what we've had is about 6 or 8,000 years of the current average temperature profile. That's never happened before in the ice ages. The ice ages, when they peaked at this temperature, only lasted 1,000 years or 2. This is the first time we've had an extended period. So what's happened? As a species, we've been able to roll up our sleeves and get on with it. And that's what we've done. And we've done quite a remarkable job. Until 150 years ago, we became so remarkable that we invented the steam engine, stuck it on a set of wheels, and Robert Louis Stevenson said, "We need some coal. Let's fire this thing up and make the beauty run." Ever since then, we've gone to hell in a handbasket.
Well, that's something, funny enough, I read the same article that you did, and it's fascinating, this idea of studying the past and studying the distant past to create and understand solutions for moving forward. And one of the stats that jumped out at me was for 800,000 years, the CO2 levels have been between 170 and 220 parts per million. But in recent memory, we're now over 400 parts per million. And considering in just such a short period of time, it's nearly doubled. This is not the trajectory we want to be on.
No, and this is why one of the reasons I wanted to approach this particular episode this way, because when I go back those 800,000 years, looking at the same graph you're looking at, you're exactly right. We've been between 150 and maybe as much as 250 parts per million of CO2. It's the natural background for the planet. But what you've seen and what I've seen is it's the last 150 years where we've just added the hockey stick. Right? So we've gone from the peak of 250, we're now pushing 450, and net zero, fine, bullshit if you can lock it in at 450, but we're not going to be quite that clever unless we really get off our asses and do something. But we're not going to be locking it in at 450, it'll go further. So the last 150 years is what's caused where we are, and whether we want to deny it or not, we are the instigators of it.
Maybe we could move on to another potential natural disaster.
So what have we got available? Something pretty benign that's happening right now, and you and I have looked at the data, is the sub-replacement fertility piece. That's not going to annihilate us. The good news about that is it may peak our population because the planet won't be able to sustain 20 billion people. We're at 8 billion now, right? But it's important to recognize this piece because it'll come up in one of the other natural disasters we want to talk about. So sub-replacement, it's not going to wipe us out, but it's happening right now.
And one way that we can definitely control the population of the Earth is an asteroid impact. Can we talk a little bit about that, Geoff?
Yeah. The point is, we won't control it. What we can do with a bit of luck is because of our space technology, we can probably avoid the risk. So I think an asteroid wiping us out, the way it did for the dinosaurs, is highly unlikely because we've already proven that we can nudge a reasonable size asteroid, can't even talk asteroid, off its path. We've already demonstrated that we can do that. And we have enough capability to detect something like that coming towards us that we have time to make that, to put that fix in place. Probability of that, very small.
I really find that it's very much science fiction becoming science fact. And this idea of the DART project, I think you were talking about with NASA, the idea that we can detect these asteroids, detect these near-Earth objects. In fact, I think that NASA is putting a special telescope into orbit specifically to look for near-Earth objects.
That's correct. Yeah.
And the idea that when we see one that could be an issue, nudging it off course, it's really, we talk about the doom and gloom episode. I was just doing a little bit of research because we often think about the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs like 65 million years ago. But what about more recent asteroid impacts? And I was looking at, they call it the Tunguska event that happened in Siberia in 1908.
Right.
And this is an asteroid that was only about 60 meters wide, and it flattened a 2,000 square kilometer area of forest in Siberia. And when I just sort of look at a map, suddenly you see that as being an area from Toronto to Halifax, from Barrie to Florida. I mean, we're talking about a massive area. So it would not take, I think, something the size of what destroyed the dinosaurs to devastate us. And
that's correct.
And so it's really good to know that there are people looking into this because... and
my speculation is we know enough about how to predict that and obviate its problem very early on in the cycle. This is why I say the probability of that is very small. Go back a century, the risk is much higher. Today, much lower.
So let's talk about another potential natural disaster, and that's electromagnetic storms, geomagnetic storms, solar disruptions, things like that.
Well, they are happening all the time. The sun is perpetually going through. I mean, the sun is a giant, vast fusion reactor, right? It is a self-sustaining piece. It's been around for 4.6 billion years. With a bit of luck, it'll go on for another few billion. Eventually, it'll burn out. But at the moment, it's not a stable entity. You look at it and say, oh, look, the sun's nice and bright. It's up there. It's yellow in the sky. But it isn't. It's bouncing around. It has solar flares. And some of them are serious enough that we get disruptions from them. Solar flares are happening all the time. We get many, many, many of them every year, every month, virtually every week. There are solar flares. But they're small enough to be inconsequential. But some of them have been big enough that they disrupted, power transmissions and that sort of thing and communications for short periods of time. So not out of the question, but I think, again, like the asteroid, it's a very, very small probability that it'll affect us. but we can't predict it. An asteroid we can predict. This we couldn't predict.
You see, I would maybe disagree slightly with you there, Geoff, in the fact that I think it has the potential to impact us more and more. And that is, I was thinking of examples like what does a solar disruption, a geomagnetic storm, what does it do? It's disrupting electrical fields. It's impacting things like GPS. Right now, maybe that messes you up on your trip to the cottage, that you can't track your trip there. But what about when we have all automated cars and autonomous cars all using GPS, all on the highways? Something like this happens. Yeah, it does not make for a good...
Let's get down to the CNE and go play Dodgem cars.
Yeah, exactly. And
it's a disaster happening.
And by that point, the people, my son or my son's children, they're not going to know how to drive a car. They're not going to know what to do. And so I think that it may be sometime in the future, but hopefully these companies that are building these cars are factoring these things in. So that we can redesign the systems before it happens.
I'm sorry.
My fingers are crossed, Geoff.
That's probably a good idea. Just make sure they don't set up with arthritis as you go, because you'll be crossing them for a long time. Either way, let me move to another one, which I think is a much more realistic scenario. If you go back in history and you look at volcanoes, our planet is not a stable entity. Earthquakes we know where earthquakes are going to happen because we know where the fault lines are and the tectonic plates match up or don't match up. Volcanoes, we know where they are. And there's, just like there is on earthquakes on the Richter scale, it's an exponential scale. There's the same thing for volcanoes. The last really serious one we had was Tambora in Indonesia in 1815. The population of the globe at that time was relatively small. It was immediately after the Napoleonic Wars. But this thing erupted with a force 7 on this scale of 0 to 8. It discharged, let me just check a number, because I think it discharged 100 cubic kilometers of debris. 100 cubic kilometers of debris. That is debris 100 kilometers wide, 100 kilometers high, and 100 kilometers deep, which spread across the world. We had a year and a half of volcanic winter. The sun did not shine, crops did not grow, the climate stopped. Starvation was a problem. This was immediately after the Napoleonic Wars, right? It's a risk. The last big one like that, I think, was about 537 BC. But these things are not out of the question. We have that structure in our planet, and we have several volcanoes. Hawaii is an area, the Indonesian area is another, and they're in other parts of the world under the Pacific. These things can happen. And we, with 8 billion on the planet, if this were to happen to us, I'm not sure we'd survive well for a year and a half if the planet was blocked out and we couldn't grow things.
No, absolutely. And I was thinking, doing a little bit of research on this, that, the other difference, of course, as you just mentioned, is population density. And we talk about, for example, Pompeii. So when Vesuvius exploded, Pompeii had a population of 10,000 people and about 2,000 people died. Well, now, what is right next to Vesuvius but Naples, with a population of 3 million? So something like that happens, there's going to be it's going to be much more catastrophic. And it is there. Yeah, I was just going to say that luckily, though, we have people on this. This is what's great is, whether you're an engineer or a scientist, there are people that are looking into these things. And we have a scientific study being done right now in Hawaii that looked at the last eruption there. And they're basically able now to build predictive models based on what's happening inside the volcano to figure out when it's going to blow. And so this idea of, being able to evacuate, you're not going to stop something like that happened in Indonesia. If it happens, it happens. But in terms of smaller eruptions, that are going to impact loss of life directly around the volcano, we at least have plans in place.
Absolutely. And if you look at something like the volcano around Pompeii at that time, that was a very small eruption. I think it was only rated as a 3 or maybe a 4 on this scale. So it's a very small, and in that context, highly localized. Tambora effectively became a global event.
Did you know, I didn't know this, we talk in the 80s, we talk about Mount St. Helens, and that, of course, getting all the press. But in 1985, in Colombia, there was a volcano that exploded. They call it the Amero tragedy, and 23,000 people died from that. And this is also the thing that sort of bothers me, is that, something happens in North America. Oh my God, we hear all about it. 57 people died in Mount St. Helen. 23,000 people died. I wonder how many of our listeners knew in 1985 there was a volcanic eruption in Colombia.
Exactly.
So, when I had never heard of that, the one that happened in Indonesia. So again, this is all about educating people, letting them know that these things do exist. They are, and we need to study history if we're going to have a path forward.
We need to study history and study the current science to stay on top of it, so we're at least informed. We won't change how these things unfold. Excuse me, right? So, we are the victims of whatever Mother Nature deals with us. We live on a volatile planet, and that's just the nature of the beast.
So we've talked about natural disasters, and you taught me a word today, Geoff.
Anthropogenic? Is that what you want me to say? Which you said I should say is man-made.
Yes. You see, we learn everything. Even our hosts, we all learn stuff on this podcast. So yes, anthropogenic.
That's exactly right.
Man-made disasters.
Man-made.
And
yes,
just from the first half of this podcast, Geoff, you think to yourself, well, Christ, we've got so many things to worry about with the natural world. Why would we create our own problems?
Well, that's exactly my point. There's 8 billion of us scurrying around on this planet, right? About 7 billion of whom are just trying to get on with their lives. And about 1 billion I might put in the category of business leaders, entrepreneurs, professional engineers, scientists, academics, thinkers. They're the ones that might be able to pull things together and make things happen in moving things forward. But the point is, we are in a situation where we have now created our own means of self-destruction in several ways. And I think about the intellectual capability that we have, and I wonder why we have the short-sighted, myopic stupidity to do what we do. If I look at it, we can annihilate, for 70 years now, we've had nuclear capability. We can annihilate ourselves as a species, right? And we're too busy, like kids in a schoolyard, threatening each other with, throwing an acorn at each other when, that acorn could be a nuclear bomb which can wipe out, 90% of the world's population. Why do we do that to ourselves? Because that's what we can do. Look at biological annihilation. That to me is a very real risk. We've got so many, if you look up there are some very, very virulent, deadly bacterial viral diseases that are active on the planet now, right? And there's several I could name, but I don't. Let me name one that's perhaps understood well, like Ebola, or something like our recent pandemic with COVID. If I combine Ebola's death capability with COVID's transmission capability, I can wipe out 3 billion people, right? We're creating an environment that is getting warmer, and it's getting more conducive to these viruses breeding mutations, because we're moving out of the stratosphere, that very narrow band of temperature, which allows for these things to migrate and change. That's part of what we've done through climate change. So we have risks there, which I don't think there's a lot of people paying attention to it, right? But I don't think we're doing it well enough. There's a risk there, in my opinion.
No, absolutely. And it goes to what we talked previously about, the expanding populations and us moving into areas that are dangerous, whether it's next to volcanoes or whether it's moving into floodplains, or in the case of these diseases that you're talking about, more interaction with wildlife and humans that didn't necessarily exist before as we sort of push out into the world. Interestingly, though, when you mentioned before that we were going to talk about biological annihilation, I, funny enough, thought we were going to talk more about biodiversity and the idea of how there's 1 million species currently on the brink of extinction and how we're losing species every day. And it's, this idea of habitat loss and deforestation, the whole chain can collapse, and that whole food chain.
And we're doing that. Yeah.
Because that's a real path.
We don't appreciate that. We don't appreciate this whole chain is linked. We survive because the parts of the chain below us feed us, whether it's plants or animals. It's part of our food and sustenance. It also creates the environment that should be healthy enough for us to breathe and live in, right? But we are creating change, which is destroying those things and therefore creates an imbalance much further down the chain, which then ripples up and eventually will come back and bite us.
Yeah, I was looking at an example of the acidification of oceans, which is directly correlates to more CO2 in the atmosphere, changes the pH levels of oceans, makes them more acidic, ends up killing coral reefs, which are breeding grounds for fish, for tourism. There was one stat that said there are 500 million people on the earth that get their food and their livelihood essentially directly from the health of coral reefs, whether that's fishing or tourism. And again, these are things that are man-made, that we can control. And I don't think people look that far down the line.
I agree with you. They don't. That's one of the reasons why I wanted this episode to put some of these things into context. There's some things on the planet we can't control. We talked about those. But all of these ones we're talking about now, we could have controlled, right? And now need to control, and we now need to find a way of capping it and reversing it. We're not there.
Okay, so what about something recently everyone's talking about, and that's AI, ChatGPT, the proliferation of artificial intelligence. Where does that fall in the?
I think when you and I started this first podcast, it wouldn't have even gone on the agenda. But that shows how remarkably quickly it has developed, right? Our first podcast was about the time when ChatGPT was launched, right? And, the pundits, the experts who created this are saying, we're in a risk situation. And if it's anything like the internet was intended to be good. And it is. It is good for so many and so much of everything we do. But the bad actors have figured out how to take advantage of it. You give them something like AI and ChatGPT, the bad actors will accelerate, and no matter how much talking we do about capping, containing, a 6-month moratorium, sort out what we knew, put rules and regulations in place, forget it. In my opinion, that genie's out of the bottle. I think it's one of the high risks that we're facing with. To me, it's becoming a higher risk all the time.
Absolutely. And I think this idea of more and more of us living by and essentially, being controlled by these algorithms that, again, are often started with the best of intentions. And I was looking at a couple of studies that were showing that 55%, for example, of human resource professionals in the US use AI in some form of another when it comes to the hiring process. And what they're discovering is that they have racial bias built into their programming, not because somebody went out of their way to do that, but because the data that they're using to educate and to learn is based on racially biased data from the past. And there was another example.
It reflects.
Go ahead.
I was going to say it reflects who we are as a species, and that's why their biases are built in. We didn't deliver it, as you said, we didn't build them in. They're there because it's picking up all of this data which contains those biases, because that data comes from humans previously.
And the more and more we come to rely on it, it's one of these things where it spits out an answer, whether it's a medical diagnosis, whether it's a recommendation to hire someone. People don't have time to double check the sources or figure out how it got to that response. They just go with it. And I don't see a matrix situation coming, Geoff, where we're all totally controlled, but it definitely, has the potential to really have an impact on our lives if we don't sort of step up and hopefully, I know the genie's out of the bottle, but maybe there's something that can be done.
Well, I'm hopeful that. I mean, it's not an area that we're going to be digging into. I mean, our task is trying to figure our way through the climate crisis and try and push the positives that can be accomplished there. But this, to my mind, is something which in the last very short time has crept up and become just a bigger problem.
So let's talk about nanobots and this nanotechnology that's becoming so,
right.
We're on the forefront. We're not quite there, but obviously we can see the potential. But with the potential for good comes the potential for harm.
Right. And I can't talk to that with any authority because I'm not digging into it, but I don't have any difficulty imagining that with the amount of self-replicating capability that these AI computers have, that I don't see how we can be very far away from self-replicating capabilities. And you couple that with even more innate intelligence building capability, we could create a subspecies which could grow into something which could be a threat to humanity. It's not out of the question.
Well, to connect it to the environmental crisis and solutions that we've actually talked about, you are starting to see people talk about, things like, building nanotechnology, building self-replicating robots that can take the carbon out of the atmosphere or who can clean the oceans. There's all of these, possibilities, and they're very exciting. But
yes,
of course,
agreed.
Once you've built an organism that can go into the ocean and, take the, take the acid, change the pH levels, do that. How do you stop it? And so there's a lot of great intentions out there.
Yes.
But it can get a little scary if it's not sort of tightly controlled.
And I think you've just put your finger on the main point. We are so freaking clever as a species. We go and put this next solution in place, and then we get surprised by the ripple effect or the knock-on effect that this solution now has given us by way of a new problem. We seem to be quite good at that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Did you want to touch a little bit more on fertility and this idea, when it comes to man-made?
No, not really. I think today, I'm hoping this was the episode where those people that want to think about it would listen. Those people that want to be in denialism will take a big fat black blanket and go onto their couch and pull it over their heads and ignore what's going on. I intended this to be a bit of a doom and gloom issue because, we need to understand that there are things we can't control, but we need to get our hands on those things we can control, and we just don't do that well. And I think AI might just be the recent, fastest developing example of how this is becoming a problem.
Let's pull it back, to the climate crisis to kind of, end where we started, as a man-made, issue, and talk just a little bit about that in terms of, our future as individuals, as a species. Can we just talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's back to our opening salvos in one of the early episodes. 2030 net zero. We have to get to 2030 net zero, because net zero just locks us in at, by that time, we could be at 450, 500 parts per million CO2 and methane and related. We'll be at a cap which is already going to cause significant global problems. And net zero at that time, as I've said many times, if we haven't got there soon and then started to turn it around down to 0, we're going to just, that is not the solution. Net zero is not the solution. Net zero 2050, 2060 is a waste of bloody time. Get off your ass and do something now. We've got to get to net zero by 2030 and have a mitigation plan in place to go down that slope, not to continue with it.
Well, we see that Mother Nature has a lot of tools in its arsenal if it's pissed off with us, Geoff. I think we've learned that, if anything.
Yes, that's absolutely the case. And I'm still fearful that she will exercise some of those, and we will live to regret it, and maybe we will die regretting it.
Mm. Any final thoughts, Geoff, before we wrap up?
Well, one of the things I would perhaps position out there is this episode hopefully is designed to give a little more thought, or a little different perspective on thought. And my positioning here would be, we can't control the natural disaster side of it. We can mitigate and react and be informed. But with what we're doing, do we really want to be in a position that our great-grandchildren and their grandchildren and so on gets destroyed because we can't get our act together and shape things up to improve? That's the legacy we are creating. And we are not reversing it quickly enough. We're going to be creating this problem. And, people like to say, well, I don't want to leave this for my grandchildren. Well, I think for the great-great-grandchildren in this, we may have left an extinct species, and they'll all be 5-year-old orphans. Those that live anyway. So, I think, I think we have a problem, and I don't think we address it adequately, globally. We've got the science.
No,
we've got the technology. We just don't get on and do it. We don't have the global leadership.
Well, we definitely have the technology. I mean, if we can send, a small little, spacecraft millions of kilometers to nudge an asteroid out of the way, we can definitely, have the know-how, and the smarts to solve the climate crisis. But it's not necessarily sexy. It's not something, that looks good on a campaign poster. And so finding that leadership is really challenging. Perhaps it is the toughest, as you said, the money is out there, the know-how is out there, it's the leadership.
Mm-hmm. But the availability of easy money by not going that path is what's still driving us. If we haven't found a way of stopping burning coal, we're not going to get there.
And I'm hoping that the podcast, if anything, raises that awareness. Because even in my own research, Geoff, for the podcast, looking at connecting the dots between, say, the climate crisis and the economy and an economic crisis. And we were talking, for example, about, rising temperatures. And people will say, rising temperatures, if the ice caps melt, sea levels will rise. That is very hard for people to imagine.
It is,
to say, am I really going to, take my garbage out because the ice caps might melt? Like, that sounds very far in the future. Whereas if you look, for example, in the southern US, I'll give you an example here. So in the southern US, because of rising heat and rising temperatures, they've actually lost in the southern states 20% of workable hours during daylight because people can't work in those conditions. And that 20% directly affects the bottom line, directly raises prices.
It's another whole piece that we haven't touched on, but you're absolutely right.
I think there's a whole episode on that, but there's a direct result that people can see of the rising temperatures and climate change. And I think hopefully this is what we're bringing to the table.
Well, that's what this podcast series is about, trying to encourage people to think outside the box and then get on board with what we need to do. because what we're creating is self-induced annihilation.
And for those people sitting on the couch, Geoff, what do you always like to tell them?
Well, there's movers and shakers in this world. The movers make things happen. The vast majority are the spectators. The spectators can sit on the couch, but my suggestion is go out there and be a mover, contribute to making things happen. We can do this if we get our act together and get on with it. Peter, thank you.
Well, Geoff, thank you very much for sharing your insights and giving me nightmares for the next few weeks. And to our audience, we want to thank you again for joining us. We love bringing you this information, and we absolutely appreciate your support, whether it's listening to us wherever you get your podcasts or whether you're watching us on our YouTube channel. We absolutely love hearing from you, so please keep those comments coming. And for Geoff Sheffrin, I'm Peter Reynolds. You've been watching Mother Nature Doesn't Give a Crap, and we'll see you next time. Hopefully.
Boom.